Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anita Bhela from the University of Delhi. And today we will be doing the module on Plato's The Republic. This module has been written by Shashi Khurana, also from the University of Delhi. In this module, we will be studying Plato's theory of forms and his theory of art and literature. If we briefly summarize Plato's ideas, then we can say the most important idea in Plato is his idea or the theory of forms. His greatest contribution was the theory of the idea and forms. He also believed that you could not gain any knowledge only through sensations, because sensations can never give you the truth. What is Plato's theory of forms? Supposing you take any article, you take an earthen pot, or you take a table, or you take a chair, or you take any object. Now, when that object is made, and there are thousands of objects of the same kind, and when you are not satisfied, then you remake the object. So what does that imply? That implies that there exists something preconceived, an idea or a form in your mind. And that idea or form is the ideal form. All others are only representations of that ideal form. Now, to carry this idea a little further, what does the pot maker or the carpenter do? He makes a copy of that eternal form. So he is, in a way, one step removed from reality. And therefore, if we go a step further and we think of the artist, what does he do? He makes a copy of what the carpenter makes or the pot maker makes. So he is even one step further removed from reality. That was Plato's idea of forms. Now, if we go to the Republic, that is his book, we find that it consists of 36 dialogues which are attributed to Plato. The Republic forms one such dialogue in common with other dialogues. The Republic presents a moral problem examined within the frame of its own terms and principles, argued in all its ramifications, and finally laid bare to the core, if still unresolved. The dialogue is between Glaucon and Adiamantus. The main discussion, of course, is carried on by Socrates. Now, Plato himself was Socrates' pupil, and he has given in his dialogues much of the dialogues to Socrates himself. So in the main discussion, which is carried out by Socrates, and what is the subject of that conversation? It is the role and status of poetry in a well-ordered state. Now, what is the issue here? Because art was very popular and a source of delight. So, what could be the issue of contention? The issue of contention was that do art and poetry have a place in the ideal or the perfect state? That is the Republic, as Plato called it. To go back to Socrates, A study of Plato must begin with his teacher, Socrates. The dates of either Plato or of Socrates, we are not completely certain, but it is said that maybe Socrates lived from 470 to somewhere 399 BCE. Now, how did Socrates teach? He taught through dialogues. Wherever he would go, he would ask questions from people. What is truth? What is beauty? And different people would give him different answers. And then, of course, he would argue with them and show them to be wrong many a time. So that in a way, the people felt that although Socrates pretended not to have any knowledge, in fact, he had a lot of knowledge and called him sly. Throughout these dialogues, Socrates is the main speaker and his views are always triumphant. As mentioned earlier, Plato's Republic is a dialogic projection of the discussion between Socrates and his friends, one on the nature of justice and the other on the status of poetry in an ideal state. It presents an outline of an ideal or perfect society, and it may be studied primarily as a book of philosophy. There is a reasoning and an order of thought. And whatever reasoning he does is for the sake of truth. And what he upholds is reasoned truth. The chief speaker, of course, is Socrates, who repeats the conversation for an unnamed group the day after it occurs. There are a number of people taking part, the main characters being Glaucon and Adiamantus. First, it begins with the discussion of old age, but later goes on to define what is justice. And then it leads to the question of what is morality in man's innermost life. It talks about the possibilities and limitations of rational argument, about problems of morality are nowhere more vivid than in the Republic. The interlocutors, that is, Adiamantus and Glaucon, wish it to be demonstrated that it is better for a man to be righteous than for a man to be unrighteous, whether or not he escapes the notice of gods and men. That is, irrespective of any possible reward or punishment. Plato, in the Republic, describes what he thinks would be the best form of human society. On what basis is the ideal state constituted? It is constituted on the basis of human nature. Whatever is good or evil in the external society depends upon the inner nature of the soul. Myths and the false beliefs taught through literature are also considered by Plato for their effect on society and the people living in it. According to Plato, human life would be perfect if it were lived according to the ideal forms. The cause of all evils, of course, is that men are blinded and that they do not have knowledge of the ideal forms. They are attracted by the transient phenomenon of the world. And at this point, Socrates wishes to explain with an image what is the actual condition of mankind in regard to education and the lack of it. That is, the lack of the idea of the ideal forms. He refers to the allegory of the cave. In the cave, there are prisoners. And these prisoners take the shadows to be the real thing. But when they see the actual sunlight, then they realize that there is a different world outside. So we, in a way, the people are like the prisoners in the cave. They are unaware of the true reality. They take shadows for real. The cave thus stands for the visible world in which we live. The fire in the cave representing the sun. Just as the cave represents the sensible world, so the sensible world outside the cave represents the ideal world of forms. The allegory also depicts the position of man on earth and his deliverance by education. Plato's theory of education again springs directly out of the allegory of the cave. What does education do? It puts eyes or sight into blind eyes. It is like turning the eye to the light, to the glory of something which has been missing in the person's life. Education is not merely concerned with the intellect, but also with the soul and turning the soul towards light. What is Plato's position regarding knowledge? Plato's position in relation to knowledge is a lack of trust in any form of knowledge but the intellectual. He puts the intellect above everything else. What is the concern of this with poets and artists and painters? They are completely ignorant of the conceptual knowledge. Why? Because a work of art, according to Plato, has no hold on reality. He represents things as they appear and not as they are or they ought to be. That is, they present the superficial world. Then Plato refers to an ancient feud between philosophy and poetry, and though reluctantly, he ultimately comes to the conclusion that poets must be banished from the ideal state. Poetry is akin to painting because it is a reproduction of a reproduction. What does a poet do? Does he perform heroic deeds about which he talks? No, he does nothing of that sort. He only presents them. He only writes about them. And he has only a grasp of what actually he's saying, but he has never experienced that. And in Plato's own words, then the imitator is a long way off the truth and can reproduce all things because he lightly touches on a small part of them, and that part an image. And he gives the example and says, a painter will paint a cobbler, he will paint a carpenter, or any other artisan. Does he know carpentry? Does he know painting? No, he doesn't. But his images may deceive some foolish people, and they may fancy that they are looking at a real carpenter or a real scenery. But educated people would not be so deceived because they know it is thrice removed from reality. To go back to Plato's ideas of the ideal forms. The forms constitute a world which exists in itself. And these forms are eternal and unchanging and can be grasped only by thought. These ideas are forms, something which the soul has perceived in its former existence. And what is all learning and knowledge but in the recollection of the soul of the forms when it perceives the things of sense. What is the role of the teacher? The role of the teacher is like that of the midwife who helps in the birth of the child. So similarly, the teacher will bring forth to the person who is being educated those images of the eternal world of forms. He will be able to show that the earthly things that are perceived by the senses are extremely fleeting and shadowy, and only images of the eternal world of forms. The Republic also talks about stories that should be told to the guardians in their early childhood, and finds certain tales that would be desirable to be told. But the other stories should not be told to the guardians. Plato was for censorship of art, and he cites passages from Homer and Sophocles, and he thinks that those passages should be deleted. And he comes to the conclusion that art has no social or educative value, that art is worthless and therefore should be banned from the ideal state. Plato himself was a great admirer of Homer, and therefore it is only with great reluctance that he comes to the conclusion that poets and poetry need to be banned from the ideal state. In his own words, he says, "Although I have always from my earliest youth had an awe and love of Homer, but a man is not to be reverenced more than the truth, and therefore I will speak out." And Plato goes on to say that what is art or painting? It is only a reflection of objects like in a mirror. He says if you were to take a mirror and turn it round and round, what would you get? You could get the images of the sun, stars, animals, furniture, anything that you wanted. But those would not be real images. Those would only be reflections and unreal. What are the implications of this for poetry in Plato's world? The implications, according to Plato, are much more for poetry than for the other arts. Because the other arts are in a way a direct imitation of the ideal form. But poetry is a third removed from truth. He also rejects poetry on psychological grounds. He says, what does poetry do? It tells us, it imitates actions and feelings which are not desirable. Whereas life would teach us to be in control of ourselves in the face of grief and misfortune, the poet seems to pay his attention to the outbursts of these feelings. And therefore, the making of these images and the person who reads these images does not learn anything. He does not learn what he should. That is, he has to have control over his miseries and his misfortunes. The real artist would not choose to imitate things. He would be interested in realities. He would be interested not in imitations. And he would desire to do things with which he could improve the state and by which he might be known as a person who did something for the men. And then he says that if you are not an imitator, and if you are able to discern what pursuits make men better or worse in private or public life, then he asked the poet, Homer, or any artist poet, to say how that person had made the state better, or how that state had been governed better with his help. And he quotes examples. He says, Italy and Sicily boast of Charan Das, and where is Solon, who is renowned amongst us? And he says, ask Homer, poet, artist, but what city has said anything about you? And so he says that the imitator, especially the poet, has no knowledge about the things that he writes. For him, it is only a kind of sport. And the tragic poets, he thinks, are the worst. Whether they write in iambic or in heroic verse, they are the imitators in the highest degree. To repeat, what would the law say? The law says that you should not be impatient, you should control your anger, and nothing is gained through being impatient. And that you should have control over your emotions and passions. And because the poet teaches the wrong things, therefore, Plato thinks that he is justified in banishing the artist from the ideal state. Of course, he says, if the poet can prove that he will awaken and nourish the better part of the soul, and then, of course, we would admit him. He says, as in a city, when the evil are permitted to wield power and the finer men are put out of the way, so in the soul of each man, as we shall maintain, the imitative poet implants an evil constitution, for he indulges the irrational nature, which has no discernment of greater and less. But he thinks the same thing at one time great and at another small. He is an imitator of images and is very far removed from the truth. That is, the poet or the artist does not cater to the better part of the soul, but to the lower part of the soul. And he repeats and says that if poetry can prove her title to exist in a well-ordered state, we shall be delighted to receive her. And he acknowledges that he is himself very conscious of her charms, but he says, but it would not be right on that account to betray the truth. And he says, if it can be proved that she is not only pleasant, but also pleasant to the states and to human life, he is willing to listen to the spirit of poetry. And if that can be proved, then he says there is use in poetry as well as a delight. He says the soul needs to be seen in its pure state, in its original purity. And when we see it in its original and pure state, it is then that we will realize its beauty. And he says, when we understand that, and we understand justice and injustice, and we will understand all the ideas related to that much more vividly. He says that the soul may be compared to that of the sea god Glaucus. Glaucus acquired a monstrous form because many of his paths were damaged because of the waves of the sea. And many of his paths were broken off and crushed and damaged. And that incrustations had grown over them of seaweed and shells and stone. So that he appeared more like a monster than his own natural self. The soul, in a similar way, does not appear in its true states as long as it is disfigured by tens and thousands of ills surrounding it. We must separate those, peel them away to see the real, pure soul. He says, if we see the soul out of the ocean in which she is now and disengage her from the stones and shells and things of earth and rock, which in wild variety spring up around her because she feeds upon earth and is overgrown by the good things of life, as they are termed, because they appear to be the good things but are not really. But it would be good to see her as she is, not in her impure but her pure state. And he comes to the idea of the just man, and he says, who is a just man? That is a person who, when he is in poverty or sickness or any other seeming misfortune, he should think that they will ultimately bring him to some good end, either in life or perhaps in death. Why? For the gods surely will not neglect anyone whose earnest desire is to become just, and by the pursuit of virtue to be like God, as far as man can attain the divine likeness. He says, what are the rewards of the just? The just can become rulers in their own city if they care to be. Those who are unjust, he says, will get their deserved punishment. Although they may escape in their youth, at last they will be found out and they will appear foolish. And when they are old, they will be flouted by everyone, strangers and citizens. They will be beaten and they will be called names unfit for the ears of the polite. Plato advises that every individual take the utmost care to follow the path of that only which is good and choose the better life as far as possible. Every individual must hold fast to the heavenly ways. That will make the person dear to others and to gods. And then he goes back to Homer to say, here I would like to say that Homer was highly respected and supposed to be the educator of the people. And it is also in this context that Plato is talking about Homer. He says that those who praise Homer and think that he is profitable for education should know that in his eyes they are excellent people, but only as far as their lights extend, means they are living in a world of illusion rather than the reality. He says that he is ready to acknowledge that Homer is one of the great poets, but he says that his belief is that in his ideal states, only the stories relating to the gods that show them as good and hymns in praise of God is the only poetry that should be allowed. Because if anyone goes beyond that and allows the honeyed muse to enter, then is the reason of mankind is being taken in the wrong direction. And it will not be logic and reason and the good that will prevail in the state, but pleasure and pain will be the rulers in our state. How do we today in the modern world react to Plato's ideas? We all who love poetry and poets, who love literature. Aristotle, his own pupil, went against him and spoke much in praise of poet and poetry. But of course, we have to remember the context in which Plato was speaking. He was not talking about banishment of poets from any ordinary state. He was talking about banishment of poets from his ideal state. And there was another reason, if we study the historical conditions, that is, the poets at that time were considered the important sources of truth and knowledge. And that is another reason why Plato wanted to banish them. But of course, his main reason was that he did not want that passions should rule the people of his ideal state, as the poets and poetry deal with human passions. Of course, Plato's views might have been shocking even to his own contemporaries, because Homer was loved by all. And today also, many critics consider his views odd, especially when he condemns the great artists, Sophocles and Homer, whom we still revere and read with delight. To sum up what we have studied today, we have studied what Plato also calls mimesis, that is, all art is imitation. In view of his theory of forms, he says all artists are thrice removed from reality. Why? Because first there exists that ideal form. And supposing there is a carpenter, he creates an image of that form. And then the painter copies that form or imitates it. So that all art is thrice removed from reality and therefore unreal. The real purpose of human beings should be to search for that ideal form, the soul removed from all its trappings, its worldly trappings, so to say. Plato also tells us that poetry and poets are the worst of the imitators and are worse than the artisans, because the artisan has knowledge of what he is creating. For example, a carpenter knows about how to create a bed. But the artist knows nothing about how to create the bed. He doesn't know anything about administration. He doesn't know anything about being a ruler. He doesn't know anything about human conduct. And yet, he presents them all as if he has complete knowledge of them. Another fault that Plato finds with poetry and poets is that they cater to the lower instincts of human beings rather than to their higher instincts. Emotions and feelings which should be kept in control are presented by the poets and in poetry, especially in tragedy. He says if the poets were to have their sway in a society, then society would not be ruled by law and reason, but by passions and only by the appearance of things and not of reality. And therefore, he banishes poets and poetry from his ideal state, including only hymns in praise of God and songs written in praise of God, or stories relating to the good of gods. Thank you. Refer to the e-text for more details.